Mark, the floor is yours.
Thank you. All right, this is a real experiment. I am going to talk about Charles Peirce and quaternions because this has been a bit of a journey for me as I've engaged with Peter and his work in physics. Really, he introduced me to the idea of quaternions, and I discovered, kind of by accident, that Charles Peirce had also been doing this stuff, and that actually there's a connection because Charles Peirce developed symbolic graphical logic, which is very closely related to Spencer Brown's logic, and sort of connections start to arise. And actually, much of what I've heard over the last couple of days has been about multiple descriptions of the same thing, and the kind of symmetries that arise between those descriptions. Now, originally I'm a musician. That was my first degree, it's my real love, really. And a few years ago, I was at a cybernetics conference, because I'm interested in cybernetics, and we had a guest who was a composer. I don't know, were you there? We went at the meeting with Pauline Oliveros?
No, I don't think so.
Okay, all right. Well, every morning, we were all in this weird hotel, every morning, Pauline Oliveros, she died last year, but she developed a whole idea of sonic meditation and a whole series of exercises whereby people could make noises, because you won't necessarily call it singing, you make noises, and the whole point is that your consciousness oscillates between your awareness of what you're doing yourself and what's happening in your environment. So I'm going to do a very simple exercise with you. It involves breathing and making a noise. That's it. Or listening. Breathing, making a noise, and listening. Okay? So in a minute, I'm going to ask you to take a deep breath, and you are going to sing any note. And when I mean any note, I mean any note. Okay? And we should have a kind of weird sound. And you sing that note for the entire duration of that breath. But as you're singing, you're listening to other sounds around you. So when your breath is finished, and they won't all finish at the same time, because some of you smoke and some of you have got smaller lungs than others, but when your breath is finished, you breathe in again, the next note that you sing is a note that you've heard. Okay? So what we should hear is some kind of dispersed sound that gradually comes together, and then basically the cycle continues. So with the third breath, you sing any sound again. Okay? The fourth, you focus in on something you've heard. I'm going to join you and make some noises on the piano. I don't know exactly what I'm going to do yet, but I think we should. Alright, you're just going to sing any note. Take a deep breath. So I'm going to ask you all now to take a very deep breath and just sing anything. Keep it going. I said, were you listening to what you were hearing and then you were trying? You were trying to.
Well, if your note was too loud, it was hard to hear other people.
Yeah, okay. I think one of the things that interests me about this, and to pull things back into symmetry, is that very often when things are symmetrical, or when you're part of something that's symmetrical, you feel it. And it's the same thing as a harmony in music, that you feel that you're part of the harmony because there's a sort of pattern that you're part of. And that's really, that's the sort of message that I want to sort of explore in a more abstract way. So if we can go next door and I can just talk to you a bit about those. And maybe we'll have some time to do some more singing.
Where was the singing?
In the harmony. I didn't know what I was coming to with this conference, so I really don't know what to say, but I had this incredibly ambitious aim that I was going to somehow talk about physics in the context of art and social theory, and because of this connection of the use of quaternions in Peter's work, which is obviously trying to redescribe physics in a way where it doesn't have this sort of divide between relativity and quantum mechanics, and between classical mechanics and quantum, it sort of resolve that, but then because Charles Sanders Peirce, who is a major social theorist really as well as a logician, his work is used in media studies and people looking at art, because he's using the same mathematical models, the same mathematical idea, I think, well actually this is very interesting, and I cannot pretend to really understand fully what I'm talking about here, but there seems to be something interesting and worth exploring. So, I have to say that this word semiotics, I've never been a particularly big fan of. You know, it's always struck me that people who sort of say they're really interested in semiotics become rather dogmatic and sort of say that is a sign for this and that's a particular kind of sign. And I was thinking, well, what's the ground for making those judgments? But understanding that Peirce was interested in a more abstract, mathematical sort of idea behind his theory helped me to sort of maybe get into his head a bit and imagine what is he really trying to say? And are the people who say that they represent his way of thinking really helping him? Or are they doing him a disservice? So a bit of, you know, reconsidering semiotics is part of what I want to do, and particularly I want to see to what extent semiotics can be understood as a way of thinking about constraint. And constraint is something very important in cybernetics. You know, many people say cybernetics is really the study of constraint. So it's always about context. It's always about it's never about the objective thing. It's about the conditions within which the thing is perceived. So how quaternions influence Peirce? That's something I'm going to say. The connection to Peter's work, connection to use of quaternions in physics. I won't say that much about it because again, I don't really understand your stuff, and I'm gradually getting a feel for it. And then I also want to say something about empiricism and information theory and the kind of practical things that this might have an effect on. And actually, you've just done some empirical work, which is actually the empirical work in music has always struck me as the most powerful empirical work because most of our abstract theories don't work in music. Okay. Now, actually, to begin this, I want to start with somebody who I've got a lot of respect for, who was very critical of semiotics. This is Ernst Gombrich, who's an art theorist. Very, very great intellect. And he wrote in 2000, he has a wonderful book called Art and Illusion, which was published in the 1950s. And he wrote a preface for it in the year 2000, just before he died. And in this new preface that he wrote, he felt the need to have a go at the semioticians, because semiotics in the year 2000 had become very much part of the sort of university humanities establishment. Everyone was doing semiotics, everyone was talking about signs and icons and goodness knows what. And he was saying, well, hang on a minute, you know, what are you actually talking about here? And so, because he's interested in art, he's interested in how art communicates. And the question is, well, are pictures signs? That's the question. And actually, what does it mean to say that? But he's got this very interesting discussion about the symbols that appear, maybe even in text. So he says, you know, okay, you could have a series of O's like that, and you could just use it as a pattern. That's not really a sign. But if you take one of those O's and put the word plum underneath it, you get this thing. And you transform the mental, what he calls, you transform the mental set of the person observing this, and they read that combination of descriptions as a sign. And basically he's arguing that, well, this is essential. We come to realise in such cases that the required mental set did not precede the reading but followed in a rapid feedback process. And I'm reading this as a semantician, as someone who sort of thinks about, I don't know, perception of objects and eigenforms, which is something that Lou talks about. It follows in a rapid feedback process. Signs and images appear together on the page. The feedback works almost instantly. Witness the ease with which our youngest reads so-called comics, combining pictures with a simple story. And I thought actually there's just a note here. I think Kant is an interesting figure in this, because Kant talked about the experience of art as an interactive process where there was free play of the imagination. And Peirce saw himself very much as a successor to Kant. He saw his own process of rethinking the categories of phenomenology, really, as a sort of Kantian, a post-Kantian exercise. And there's one more thing to say about Gombrich. Gombrich makes this, again, a fascinating insight. This talks a story about John Constable, the artist John Constable, who painted this. And he went to see, in 1823, a demonstration of photography. It's one of the earliest prototypes of photography. And his comment is extraordinary, I think. It's in part a transparency. The spectator is in a dark chamber, and it's very pleasing and has great illusion. But it is outside the pale of art because its object is deception. The art pleases by reminding, not deceiving. And I think, well, that's a very profound thing. And if you think about the difference between, well, actually, I suppose there's a question there. What does that mean? But I think it means something. So, this is my interpretation of what that means. A sign becomes a sign as a result of the coordinating expectations through its descriptions. Or the coordinating of expectations through its descriptions. So, each description, each layer that we pour on something, it works as a sort of constraint in the interpretation of a thing. And you may even say that descriptions are redundant representations of the same thing. So even in the way that I'm expressing myself, there's my voice, there's the words that I'm using, there's the way I'm using my hands, there's I'm using my body, and so on. All of these different descriptions. You could probably have an audio recording, and you wouldn't see my face, or you could just have a text without me speaking the words. So there's a certain degree of redundancy between these descriptions, and that sort of weighs in on the thing that we might call a sign. And I think that seems to ring true with this, with Gombrich's idea of the plum. You know, that you have an image, you have a word, and of course this all hints at the importance of the environment, the importance of context in perception. I don't know where the contrast between this and art is something maybe again this is a speculation, but I think artists remind, if Constable is right about reminding, artists remind because they manage to overlay many descriptions which reproduce a complexity which we can relate to in the flow of experience. So in the experience of, I don't know, the emotional experiences of falling in love or being excited or whatever it might be, that there is a pattern of complexity and that the artist is able to reproduce that flow of complexity which we can relate to in some way. It's not the same as creating, as sort of producing descriptions to sort of determine an object.
You seem to be referring to art as referential.
No, that's not my intention.
Okay, but it sounded that way.
Yeah, that's not my intention. In fact, it's the opposite. Okay, so I think at the heart of this is this topic of constraint. So I'm thinking, well, okay, well, what did Peirce know about constraint? And well, he was doing all of this stuff. He was doing these graphical, logical diagrams, which are very similar to the work that Spencer Brown was doing. So there's Spencer Brown at the bottom right there. This is Peirce. And actually, if you look at it, the only thing he doesn't get is recursion. It's the sort of re-entry. But
And the unmarked state.
yes, but it's a pretty remarkable intellectual thing he's doing. He's clearly
And he has quantification.
Yes.
Sort of lines and things.
yeah. I mean, it's amazing.
Does he have relationships there? Like saying one is in a certain relationship to another?
Yes.
Okay, I just want
Yeah. I mean, and in fact, what's impressive about him is that this is only one representation of his logic. He'll produce a number of different representations, including a sort of existential quantifier, as kind of a summation of different perceptions. I mean, it's impressive stuff. And then you come on, I mean, this is what everybody thinks about with Peirce, is, or people who know the sign theory, that the sign theory is a sort of relationship between a sign, a thing that the sign is there to express, and an interpretant, what he calls an interpretant, which is a kind of, is a person to sort of say that this sign represents that, and that these are in this sort of dynamic relation. Of course, the most important thing from the point of view of quaternions is there are 3 dimensions here. And in fact, there are 3s everywhere in Peirce. So he develops, I'll just say something about the quaternion. I mean, his work has got quite a number of workings out of quaternion multiplication tables. This is from an appendix to one of his books where he's talking about nonians. And Sylvester, you probably know this, Louis, a guy called Sylvester who did some work on nonians. And Peirce's interest in this.
The term.
What is a
Yeah.
nonian?
It's like a higher level quaternion.
You've got 9.
Yeah.
Oh, not an octonian, but
Yeah.
But it's not a division album,
Oh, okay.
which octonian.
Okay, so everything's in 3s. Now, Peirce wanted to engage in a sort of Kantian project of identifying primary categories of experience. And he thought there were 3 of them. Okay? And he called them firstness, secondness, and thirdness. And what's really interesting about this is that they are sort of dimension, they increase in dimensions. So the firstness is a kind of scalar, and the secondness is a sort of 2-dimensional, it's almost like a sort of an antagonistic thing. And thirdness is a sort of 3-dimensional vector relationship. And when I saw this, and having sort of engaged with Peter's stuff and the way he categorises mass and time and charge, I thought this looks very familiar. And actually, is this a connection then between the way that we think about physics? I mean, this is all about ways of thinking. Is this a connection between the way that we think about physics and the way that we think about the concepts that we use for actually everything? Is it all science? And he goes much further in terms of thinking about these sort of triadic relationships. So what I've got here is again that sort of basic sign, the thing that the sign represents and the interpretant, and then in these sort of outer circles, his three categories. So there's firstness, secondness, and thirdness going out there. And for each category within these, along these axes, he's got a different name for a different quality or different type of sign. I won't go through them all, but the most famous one is this one down here, which is the different ways that a sign can be, the different ways that a sign can represent its object. So he's saying that an icon is where a sign it has a sort of immediate quality that relates directly to the thing that it represents. We all know about icons because we've got them all on our computers. An index is where there's a sort of a referential a reference between the sign and the thing. So smoke, for example, is an index for the presence of fire, and a symbol is a sort of a normatively established idea which has been it's established in discourse, basically, in habit, that kind of thing. Again, just thinking about Peter's stuff, and I was thinking, well, actually, the interesting thing about this diagram, and if he's interested in quaternions, then he must presumably be interested in the sort of rotational dynamics of quaternions. And what happens if you start to shift this kind of stuff around? And how does that relate to, you know, what we see as an icon or an index or a, you know, this is a shifting context. And so that led me to think, well, actually, what does it mean for something, for us to say that sine x is the same as sine y? So, under what circumstances is the label that we ascribe to something, or our identification of something, in some way its properties are conserved? So, I mean, this is a bit speculative, really. And so I was sort of playing around with this. You know, for conservation, if you change something, does it produce a direct and proportional change in something else, and can you reverse it? For commutativity, if you change the order, do you change the outcome? And the sort of distinction between real and imaginary, can it be directly reversed or only inferred from its effects? And these things are obviously things that Peter's been looking at in the way that he's looking at fundamental physics, but it seems that some of this also maps on. And once you've got this sort of pattern, you can see that actually you can have lots of ways in which you can take a particular sign object and interpret in relation, and map that onto Peirce's triadic structure. And it may be even that these two things, which are obviously plotted against different degrees of firstness, secondness, and third, they may be the same object. So what you could have here is actually, these are two descriptions of the same thing. And how does that work? What are the dynamics of it? I did a little, see if I can show you this. Just to bring it to life, I even did something here. Oh, there you go.
So when we interpret a sign, are we locked in this quaternion three-dimensional kind of relationship? Is that what's...
Well, I wouldn't say locked
Locked,
necessarily.
but
There's something happening. So the context within which you're making your perceptions is always shifting.
Okay.
And in fact, every perception, so every note that I play on the piano is not the same as the previous note, because the context within which it's played has changed. And partly it's been changed because of the thing that I've just done. So I'm scribbling on here, you know, when is something the same?
So could it be possible that the identity relation doesn't really exist? Or it's just
Well, I don't even know what exist means in that statement.
in our perception?
So this is basically the same kind of thing. It's about similarity, because if we don't have similarity, how can we count anything? If we don't have regularity, how do we have induction? How do we make sense of the world? But actually, induction isn't straightforward either.
I think the answer is that of the Red Queen in Alice in Wonderland. Things are what I say they are.
Well, that's very interesting that you should say that, because of course that does suggest that it's politics that in the end is the thing that determines the way that we see the world. It's power. Now, that may be true, but how do we make sense of that? Yeah, I mean, some musical examples. So, you know, these notes. Are they the same as one another if I go and play them? I won't play these, but I might play this. Because this is interesting. So this is Twinkle Twinkle Little Star.
Twinkle little bats get those
Okay, what we can do... Are they the same?
No.
Why not?
Different context.
But there is a certain sense in which people would say it was the same.
Similar.
If you were singing Twinkle Twinkle Little Star,
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's still Twinkle Twinkle Little Star.
so what does that mean to say
They are
it's the same?
similar but not identical, I would say.
Under what circumstances would we count them?
Well, you've actually made the melody the same and some of the accompaniment different, which and the melody does stand as a
We
lead.
have to make distinctions.
It's the language part of it. I might say.
Well, there is some structural feature in common.
Okay.
So any features.
But there's also something very important in music, which I saw demonstrated, of somebody who played one of Beethoven's classical pieces that the kids learn, and from the way that the kids hammer it out, to the way he beautifully plays, same notes. The only thing that there is the internote spacing,
Yeah.
you know, which makes it a completely different
Perception.
perception.
And I don't know, I mean, it does remind me of the... Sorry.
No, I was just commenting on Anton's, that it's not just spacing but also tone and the loudness. Yeah, and so it's more than just one.
There's a very famous comedy duo, you'll know about this.
Oh yes,
Morecambe and Wise, and Eric Morecambe has to play Grieg's Piano Concerto, and which he plays in a dreadful way with Andre Previn, and Previn eventually it goes up to him and it says, "You're playing all the wrong notes," and Eric Morecambe says, "No, I'm playing all the right notes, but not necessarily in the right order."
Mr. Preview.
Yes, Mr. Preview.
Mr. Preview, that's right.
Yeah, Mr. Preview.
That's really good.
That's brilliant.
So, changing contexts and the determination of sameness. That's where we've ended up. Well, that's where I've ended up. And I just don't know. But I think this is so important because we do a lot of counting now. We're sort of, our big data people are counting everything. Mostly they're counting words, which again, if you come back to Alice in Wonderland, is a really problematic thing to do. And what's going on with this? I mean, what is I here?
The number of internal degrees of freedom, maybe? Or?
No, we do know what I is. I is a particular sort of index of a phenomenon which you're going to count. How do you know?
Someone had to tell us.
That's what we've been told.
Yeah.
As the interpretation of that particular expression.
But there's a lot of confusion in that equation.
Yeah.
A lot of what?
A lot of confusion.
But on the other hand, if you can reinvent it, it's not just drawn out of the air. If you study
What the variables are. If
Yeah.
you don't, then it's medicine.
Yeah. Yes, and often you find, you see, when we use it to measure natural phenomena, because I've thought a lot about how would you use this to think about music. But of course, when you look at something that's growing, you start with a certain set of variables, but after a period of time, you've got a whole new set of phenomena to think about. You make a whole new set of distinctions because the thing has evolved to the point where it has property A, B, and C instead of X, Y, and Z.
But is a problem with counting. You cannot count different kinds of objects.
You can.
No.
Copies don't.
And so,
But when is an object a different
if
kind
you
of object?
count apples and pears,
Yes.
You have-
If you use them as markers.
you have to presuppose that you count them in as much as they are fruits, not as an apple or as a pear. What I mean is that there must be a criterion for identifying the kind of thing you are, presupposition about the kind of thing you are counting. Isn't it so?
Which is this problem, again, of when you go to a meta level and then you just include it back in, which was something that came up in
Are you saying there's a
yours
problem
and
with
stuff.
knowledge or a problem with acquisition of knowledge?
Well, it's probably both. I mean, this is something which has really fascinated me, and actually, the Red Queen incident is very interesting because there is an intersubjective part of this where it isn't necessarily what I think, but it may be what we agree, and the extent to which we agree, and what agreement means, that's another thing, is possibly the extent to which we can coordinate our actions together effectively. So it does, it sort of does pull back to communication and people, and maybe whether this is a weakness in Peirce, maybe he didn't see this. Maybe he was like a lot of very clever intellectual people who's so sort of wrapped up. He reminds me of Husserl. I think Husserl probably had the same thing, although Husserl was the first person to talk about intersubjectivity. He never really got the full richness of what social engagement was. But these two statements I think are fascinating. So we could not be persons for others, not even for ourselves, if we could not find with the others a common environment as the counterpart of the intentional interconnectedness of our conscious lives. This common environment is established by comprehension, which is in turn founded upon the fact that the subjects reciprocally motivate one another in their spiritual activities. And then he goes on to say, I speak of another person as within reach of my direct experience when he shares with me a community of space and a community of time. One of the really key things in Schutz is that particularly when we're in face-to-face engagement, we get old together. The time is a shared thing between us. And he wrote particularly beautifully about music in this way, that music is this sort of shared experience of time. So
that's very true of meditation in group.
yes,
That's
yes. Well, I thought exactly that when you were doing the thing.
Yeah.
Now, we'll talk about that in a minute. I've been puzzling about this, and I've been doing my own experiments. Because although there are problems with counting, Shannon might be the best thing that we've got right now until we get something. I don't know. I'm very interested. There's a particular aspect of Shannon's equations called relative entropy, and I understand that the quantum mechanics people use this as a way of looking at entanglement. It's basically looking at the probability distribution of phenomenon X and the probability of distribution of phenomenon Y, and looking to see how they correlate. I'll show you a couple of things that I've done, and you might want to see if this works.
Can you define what you mean by intersubjectivity?
It's the extent to which, when we communicate, build up a picture of you and your inner world. And if I didn't have a picture of you and your inner world, I probably wouldn't be able to form an utterance that I could reliably predict how you would react to it.
Okay,
And Schutz's idea is that we all do this.
right.
That actually we couldn't communicate, we couldn't actually have some idea of the inner life of the person that we're talking to.
But do you deal with the issue then that the judgment of that always has to be in the apparent connection occurring in the outer world, which doesn't actually tell you whether that was going on, it only tells you that the result was there. You understand? It's only an interaction that matters, not what actually was meant.
There is no actually.
Of course there is, that's what we see we're doing now.
Well, no.
I can't see what's going on in your mind, but I can hear you speaking.
We're engaging in communication within a set of constraints. And
We hope so.
well, I mean,
That's what we've got.
yeah, I mean, but there may come a point where we decide that we don't understand each other, and in which case, what Schutz would say is that one or the other person's model of the others in the world doesn't work.
Except that I'm interested in the case where we agree, but in fact don't understand each other. That's not excluded from what you're saying. And that leads to quite a lot of difficulties in the minor splitting, in fact, with quantum mechanics, for instance.
Well, one of the things that we have to do when we communicate is express our lack of understanding.
Yeah, at least need sympathy for it. But you can't do it fundamentally, can you? You don't know where the boundary to that is.
If you were wanting to say that would you want to say that there was an absolute boundary?
Well,
Does the boundary emerge in the interaction?
You have nothing but the communication to work with, because the brain is not accessible.
Yes, that's right. You have nothing but the communication to work with.
Yes and no, because you also have non-verbal signals, and that's actually how we build the picture of a person.
Yes, but
Those imperceptible. Yeah, it is really important. It's actually more than it's probably more than about 90% of how we build a picture of another person.
we presume that. But of course, when the murderer hugs his proposed victim to give him confidence, it doesn't mean that he's not going to murder him. You really can't get underneath that fact that you're trying to decipher something that's not visible.
Let's leave this for another time. I think Mark needs to get on.
Well, I just want to show you a couple of things. So this is actually a dance. This is Siobhan Davis, a very famous dancer. And I saw this in a local art gallery near me, and she was doing it. And I thought, well, this is most interesting. This is intersubjectivity in action, in a very real sense, that they're reading each other in very much the same kind of way that we were doing with music. But what you also see is a double description of the same thing. You see both of them, effectively, as we've gone, both of them
Coordinating, right?
yeah, coordinating their actions. And it's the most beautiful example of tuning in to each other that I know of, actually.
Synchronized diving.
Yes, that's a good one.
That's pretty amazing.
Yeah.
I've got a couple of others, so let's see if I can get.
Look at two guys who go like
Jazz is exactly the same, but the music seems proper.
Sorry? Yes, jazz is the same.
Jazz,
Except that there are a set of rules. I'm not saying that there aren't a set of rules in what they're doing with their dance, but the rules of jazz are quite well formalised. There is a norm. So, why isn't this working? Open it. Yeah, that's not working. I might have screwed that up. Okay, so this is an experiment I did, and I wrote some code, and I was interested in measuring the different dimensions of music which I might improvise on the piano. And so I sort of had 4 dimensions. No, actually there are 5 dimensions there. And I was exploring, as I was playing, what the relative entropy measures were between, say, the rhythm, the pitch, tonality, the harmonies that I was playing. And so what each of these represents is a sort of a network relation between each of these dynamics. And I really want to come back to this because there's something really interesting. And what it led me to think about is that actually, even when we look at videos of people giving lectures, I'm an educational technologist, so I'm very interested in videos of people giving lectures, that actually you can do the same thing. So you can look at the words that they speak, you can look at the pitch of their voice, you can look at the sort of gestures that they make, you can look at the things that they might write on the board, and each of these things has a sort of, they're all relating to each other. Each description that we make is constrained by every other description.
Mark, could you just clarify what you mean by the relative entropy of the 5 things that you're talking about?
So, if I've got, because there's no sound, let's see if I can put the sound up. I don't know what that is. It's not very loud, unfortunately. So what have I got there? I've got a piece of music which you can't really hear it very well. This is an improvisation. It's got a rhythm, and the rhythm is actually quite regular.
Mm-hmm.
So actually, you would expect to see a sort of a fairly low value in terms of the entropy of the rhythm. It uses a kind of a period of a window to measure that.
Okay.
Okay.
So you're going along and you're comparing, say, the entropy of the rhythm to the entropy of the spanning the scales,
Yes,
or
yes.
I mean.
Yes. So there will be times, for example, when in music very often, I can demonstrate this. What you have is. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah.
So what you might have is
I was doing some experiments with cost automatons.
you can look at 2 dimensions of that. So you can look at the rhythm of the accompaniment. Now, the accompaniment at some point shifts, the tonal thing shifts because the harmony is different. The melody line has a different kind of pattern. So, if you look at it, I can't remember exactly what I did, but that's a different pattern, obviously.
So you're, in a sense, you're comparing the left hand and the right hand, or are you looking at the whole thing?
You can do all of it. You can look at left hand and right hand. You can look at harmony, tonality, and actually the graph that I've got here. This is actually just taking three values, and this is actually taking data from a video. So this is a video of a young American mathematician who does amazing videos. She's called Vi Hart, and she does amazing videos on this one's on Fibonacci. And all I did was, I got data for the pitch of the voice, for the events on the video, and what was the other thing? The text. I did an analysis of the text, and I looked for entropy in each of those dimensions. And then I sort of just looked. I was interested to see where the changes in entropy coincided. And basically, it's plotted on parallel coordinates. So the parallel coordinates are just values of entropy. So you can take one feature and compare it to another in the same axis.
And so you have a time window that you run along the signal, and you're looking within that time interval and saying entropy of this is this, entropy of that is that. Look for a correlation between the two.
Yes.
That's interesting.
And the is that you can keep on adding stuff into this, so you don't need to be constrained by any particular set of variables. You can just say, well, you might, the obvious thing that people always say is, well, what about measuring this, or what about measuring that? Well, throw that in as well. And what I haven't done is looked at ways in which you might be able to identify new features as things emerge. But that might be possible too. It should be possible. So those are my experiments really. What's that got to do with purse? Well, it's got everything to do with context. The thing with this kind of thing is that the context is continually shifting, and that every distinction that you make is framed by the context that's created by every other distinction that you might make, as well as other stuff that's sort of surrounding it.
Can I ask one last quick question? So, from the visualization of the sort of the intersubjectivity, do you, after a bit of experience with that, do you begin to hear the differences in what you're recording in terms of the signal that you're seeing, or you don't see a pattern at all? It is
yeah, you do. I did see in fact, I saw a pattern, and that changed the way I played. I was very reminded of a statistician called Gordon Pask. I don't know, I mean, Lou will know about Gordon Pask. But Gordon Pask, one of his early projects in the 1950s was to create a machine which responded to music. It was called Musicolor. And it did this kind of stuff. It was looking at entropy signals from the music and then making calculations. It put on a light show. And it would get bored. So if you did the same thing over and over again, you'd get bored and you'd try and wake up and perform.
Just another question. So your impression from looking at the graphs and the way you represented it, does it make any impression on your auditory imagination, in a sense?
Yes.
So there's an interpretation in there that goes back to the auditory system. There's an interplay between the visual cortex and the...
Yeah, I was very puzzled by this, because obviously you do these kinds of things, you're trying to be objective, but of course you're sucked into the whole thing.
Yeah.
Anyway, so that's pretty much it. I've got a little thing to finish off. If I can do that. Yeah, so it's my final speculation. To see something to be the same is to see oneself as part of a shifting symmetry. And I'm wondering, I've got to kick that one around a bit. And then this is A. That's it. Sorry.
You want us to talk about it? I was going to say that the nice example for you is the well-known joke that a topologist is someone who can't tell the difference between a coffee cup and a donut.